Welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to the Stade de France, and welcome back to Tim from Egg Chasers.
Yes.
How are you, Tim?
Very well, mate, very well.
We made it. End of the World Cup.
Well, we've got a day or two yet left.
We've got a day or two. It's been a long old World Cup. We're here, obviously, outside the Stade de France, where you'll be able to hear they're practicing the anthems before the fourth place playoff. That's not what we're talking about in this video. With the greatest respect to that game, this is all about a World Cup preview. Yes. New Zealand against South Africa tomorrow night. Tim, standing here now on Friday, a little over 24 hours until that game. Just immediate thoughts. What are your thoughts ahead of it?
Firstly, it's just absolute privilege. Just staring at that trophy on the banner there, the Webb Ellis Cup, and the fact that I'm going to be at a World Cup final. Go back 6 weeks and I went to my very first ever World Cup game, and it was England versus Argentina in Marseille. You were here on opening night when it was France v the All Blacks. And it just makes me reflect on what a journey it's been. I think it's been a fantastic World Cup. Agreed. And it is the two titans of world rugby, isn't it? Going head to head. And I'm just looking forward to sitting back without a dog in the fight and being able to enjoy what will hopefully be an intense match. You
look at what's on the line. Biggest rivalry in world rugby. Both nations on 3 world titles already. Who can be the first to get to a 4th? From the Springboks perspective, looking to go back to back, the only other team to do that, New Zealand 2011 to 2015, and everyone talks about that being the greatest team ever. There are so many different avenues we can get into. Go on.
And I'll add, as South Africans always say, if they do win tomorrow night, they'll have won 50% of all the World Cups they've entered.
Because they weren't in
the first two.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's fascinating. Where I am at the moment, looking ahead to that game, is my head says New Zealand because they had an easier semi-final. They had an extra day's rest. I think you look at South Africa's path to the final, it's the toughest route to a final I think we've ever seen at a World Cup. But then I also start thinking about it, and I think whenever the best teams have met at this World Cup, there's been hardly anything in between them. I think it's so difficult to call.
Yeah, and do you know what, just to fold into what you're saying and add to what you just said a minute ago about this, what's at stake. Sia Khaleesi, the man who lifted this trophy 4 years ago, he described this as the biggest game in rugby's history.
And did you hear what he said as well, that he thinks this will be the biggest game of his life as well? There won't be any bigger.
Yeah, that's amazing what's at stake. Interesting. So my gut feeling, and that's just what I'm going on at the minute, is I don't know why, I just lean ever so slightly in the Springboks' favour, but I totally agree with you that there will be so little between these teams. I think it's going to come down to the final 20 minutes, as it has done in all of those big games that we've talked about.
And let's get onto it then, the final 20 minutes, the benches. 7-1 bench split for a Rugby World Cup final. It is the biggest selection call in the history of the sport. I don't think that's overstating it.
No, it's not. And I think maybe it's not as big a call as we think, because injuries aside, it is South Africa just turning up the dial on what they do really well, isn't it? It's them going, this is our strength, let's just turn that up to 11.
And what I would say as well is, when I say it's the biggest selection call in the history of the sport, I don't even really mean it in a negative way. I think Jacques Nienaber and Rassie Erasmus have earned the credit in the bank to be able to trust them to make these big calls. But when you think of a World Cup final, not having a replacement scrum half on the bench, they say that Cheslin Colby will be the man to step in at 9 if anything was to happen to Faf de Klerk. I mean, it is just a complete sign, isn't it, of where South Africa think that final tomorrow night here is going to be won, which is up front 5, certainly the forward pack.
Yeah, and it's just fascinating given that it was a 5-3 split last week against England. Rassie and Jacques were talking about 8-0, 7-1, 6-2, 5-3, and it seemed like they'd gone away from this, but they go back to it for the first time since Twickenham at a World Cup final.
Well, they did it against Ireland.
Oh no, they did it against Ireland, sorry.
Which in itself is interesting.
Yes.
So they did it against Ireland in the pool stages, and actually a lot of people after that game said maybe it didn't work in their favour. So I think that's why it is absolutely fascinating.
What Ireland and New Zealand have got in common is that they haven't paid any attention to it or changed or deviated from what they do. Or have they? Because New Zealand have Nepo Laulala on the bench. They seem to have gone for the biggest guys they can in the front row.
And what's really interesting about that, when I did my video on the channel reaction to the New Zealand team news, I said I love the fact that the All Blacks aren't really reacting to what the Springboks are doing. They've gone 5-3. I thought they would go 6-2 on the bench. But actually, you're right, and Ian Foster spoke about it. Going for Nepo on the bench is their heaviest prop, essentially. I wonder whether Sam Whitelock on the bench is also somewhat to counteract the weight of that Springbok pack coming on in terms of having his sort of body in those scrums later on in the game. So actually, New Zealand have reacted to it. And that's a big responsibility for him to come on and know that his task is basically to be a major factor in dealing with that South African scrum.
I think you are going to see a massive last half hour from South Africa. We've seen it the last 2 weeks, and I think the challenge for New Zealand is to be in front, and in front by enough. England, for them, 9 points wasn't enough. I think New Zealand, if they were 9 points up, they can bring it home, but I think they need to be ahead going into the final quarter.
And one of the biggest things for me when I look at this New Zealand team, and if you particularly look at the development under them, they've brought Schmidt in and Ryan in, there's been changes in the coaching staff who I think have had a really positive impact on this group. The biggest change in this New Zealand team from where they were when they got branded the worst All Blacks team ever and everything like that.
By the way, doesn't that just seem like a bonkers... I mean, well, let's wait and see how tomorrow goes, but if the world champions are only months before the worst New Zealand team of all time...
Well, I mean,
Anyway, I interrupted your point.
No, but there's something to be said in that as well, isn't there? That I think from a lot of neutrals' point of view, and I can imagine All Blacks and Springbok fans get a little bit sick of hearing this. I don't think it's a criticism of them. A lot of people were hoping for an Ireland or France to be in the final because it was someone new, but it's the two old superpowers who have got themselves to the final. Can't remember what I was saying. Oh, I was saying about the New Zealand pack and all the changes they've made. It is the change to that front five. Them improving in that area is, I think, the difference between the New Zealand we saw when they were getting heavily criticised and the team that have got themselves to a final.
And on that Twickenham game when New Zealand were absolutely panned, I seem to remember, whilst South Africa blew them away and had the 7-1 split, Lomax came off really early in that game.
Yeah.
They haven't had this front five since they were in the Rugby Championship when they were on top. The challenge is, can they match the bench?
Yeah, Retallick was injured as well for that game. Barrett got sent off early. So there are things that New Zealand, I think, will point to. My big analogy for this week, Tim, is trilogy fight.
Love it.
This is the trilogy fight. 2 games so far this year. 2 fairly one-sided. The Rugby Championship in the end, actually, South Africa really came back into it, but New Zealand had built up such a lead that they were able to hold on. Obviously then blown away at Twickenham 35-7. So trilogy fight here, stadium sellout for the biggest prize in the sport. I said my head's kind of telling me New Zealand. I do think it's a complete flip of a coin, but Faf de Klerk, Andre Pollard as the halfbacks, not a surprise they've come back in. An indication of the game plan we're going to see and the type of game I think we're going to see certainly from the Springboks.
Yeah, interestingly, in the games up to this point, New Zealand have actually kicked more than South Africa. But I think that may flip for the final. I mean, it's just started to rain here outside the Stade de France. There's a very good chance that the weather will be, at best, it'll be spitting rain. It could well be chucking it down. I think South Africa are going to kick a lot more, and I have them edging it. I have them edging it.
South Africa?
South Africa.
Okay, interesting. I'm still moving towards New Zealand, but I got asked on the channel the other week of who do you want to win, and it's genuine true. I don't have a horse in this race. I want it to be a great final. I think if you look at the knockout games we've had at this World Cup, barring the New Zealand-Argentina semi-final, we have had some brilliant knockout games. If we get a great final as well, all of a sudden I think we'll be looking back on this World Cup incredibly fondly. Yeah, and by a great final, it doesn't need to be high scoring, it just needs to be intense, tense, fully committed, physical, brutal. I think all those things are exactly what we're going to see, and hopefully a bit of magic and no controversial refereeing decisions. Although we got Wayne Barnes, they're probably the best performing Englishman in rugby union. Yeah, probably. There's a lot of people saying we've still got an Englishman in the final, it's Wayne Barnes. Although I'd imagine he might have been watching that semi-final last week a little bit nervous that he was going to miss out on another opportunity to ref it. So that's our predictions. Genuinely think it could go either way. Make sure you go and check out Egg Chasers. Tim doing some brilliant stuff through this World Cup, so go and subscribe to him. Subscribe to this channel as well, and drop a comment down below. Let us know, who do you think is going to win the World Cup final 2023, New Zealand against South Africa, the biggest rivalry in the sport, here tomorrow night. Nice one.